Although we need to go to Rumble pretty soon because they're gonna start censoring.
Okay, well, I want to welcome everyone who has come here in person. We have some more people coming in here now in person. If you all could sit in here, then you'll be able to hear as better. Anyway, I want to welcome everyone who's online, everyone in person, and our guest, Ray McGovern. And yeah, I'm going to have to ask if everybody online can mute yourselves, and also everyone in the room, if you can mute yourselves as well. And then we can get started. And we're really honored to have Ray McGovern here. Ray is a 27-year veteran of the CIA. An analyst specialized, I believe, the head analyst on Russia while in the CIA, and also the presidential daily briefer for multiple presidents, starting with Jimmy Carter. And Ray has been a very strong voice. He spoke recently at the UN and the Security Council talking about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And also he regularly appears on various podcasts talking about Ukraine. So I think we're in for a real treat today. And Ray, would you like for me to share your slides to start out, or do you want to say a few words first?
Well, let me say a few words. I want to thank you for inviting me to do this. I want to apologize beforehand for a little cold that I seem to have developed, but I have no chills now, and hopefully everything will go well. I do have some slides prepared, and they focus in on what an intelligence analyst would focus in on. That is the facts, who says them, when they said them, and why people do things, why they say they do things, why they do them, and appropriate scrutiny to whether what they say is correct or not. I want to just focus in now on the late February decision by Mr. Putin to send his troops into Ukraine. And not many people know what would immediately preceded that. Yeah. And I think I have a story to tell. I hope it won't be too long, but if you could sit back and have a cup of coffee or something, and if you listen intently, then chances are you will have some really good questions for me. So if we could start now, Anne, we could start with that first slide.
This is not my usual computer. Sorry, I'm going to try to find the presentation here is on the desktop. Sorry about this. Oh, there it is. Yeah. I'm going to do this.
Can everyone see that?
Yes. Yes.
You can, okay. Good, well, let's start here. What most people don't know is that there on the left, you have a diagram based on statistics from the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a non-biased organization, and they had observers on the ground. And when they were observing the shelling in the Donbass, in those two places there called Donetsk and Lugansk, this is what they reported at the end of February 2022. I hope you can see that it is a sort of exponential increase, that it pretty much came to a head or went really high on the 16th. Is that what it is? Yeah, the 16th or the 18th of February. And usually this kind of artillery barrage precedes the kind of invasion of this territory that you would expect. So this is what everyone was looking at, particularly, of course, the Russians across their border. It wasn't very much played up in the Western press for reasons you probably understand. If we could have well, do we need to say anything more about that? Just that, look at the graph itself there. The first date there is the 14th of February, 2022. And you'll see it spike all the way up to the 21st and the 22nd. And of course, the 24th was when the Russian troops went in. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, now on the 21st of February, I say colloquially that he threw the kitchen sink at us. Probably more serious than that. These were a list of grievances that he listed in a speech that he gave on the 21st. So after this spike in shelling, and this was shelling of mostly civilians in the Donbass. So he's saying, look, Kiev, Ukraine, is trying to orchestrate a blitzkrieg in the Donbass against almost 4 million Russian speakers. UN-approved Minsk agreements are not honored by the West. We'll go into those a little bit later. So it's necessary to take a long overdue decision and immediately recognize the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk. Now, why does he say a long overdue decision? Well, because after the US and European orchestrated coup in Kiev on 22 February 2014, Donetsk and Lugansk pleaded with Putin, please, you're taking Crimea into Russia, please take us too, please incorporate us, and he wouldn't do it. And the reason he wouldn't do it is because Germany and France assured him that the Minsk process would give a degree of regional autonomy to those areas and that there would be a ceasefire that would stay. Those promises, of course, were not realized. Now, on that same day, February 21st, defense treaties were signed between Russia and these newly recognized as independent countries, Donetsk and Lugansk. Next slide, please. Okay, so the treaties called for mutual defense cooperation, of course, and Donetsk and Lugansk wasted no time in invoking them and requesting Russian help. Now, on the 24th, Putin, try to remember, Putin was trained in the law, okay? And whatever you think of Putin, he tries to take steps to make things legal. And what he cited here was Article 51 of the UN Charter, which allows the kind of thing that he was doing in his reckoning, okay? Lavrov. Now, Lavrov, many months later, we're talking 23 now, he said, look, Germany, France, and Ukraine have now confessed that they simply used the Minsk process, that is, they're trying to work out some autonomy for Donetsk and Lugansk, a ceasefire that would last and no more shelling. But they used these accords to pour weapons into Ukraine. And Lavrov said, if the Minsk agreements were implemented, there would have been no need for what they call the special military operation. I think that argument would hold. Now, here's Minsk. There is Putin in the middle with Angela Merkel on the side. and Francois Hollande, the president of France at the time. Suffice it to say that Merkel later recognized, it was last December actually, that the Minsk process was simply a way to delay any action by Russia so that the US and the Western allies could build up the defenses and pour weapons into Ukraine. And she said, now look at Ukraine. Back in 2014, it was pretty weak. Now, because we use the Minsk process as a delaying tactic, look what we got now, a very sturdy Ukraine army. She said that last December. Hollande said it the next month. Yeah, that's what we did. We kind of diddled the Russians on that one, didn't we? Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine at the time, said it the month after that. And of course, Zelensky has also said it. So, wow. Here is the what Lavrov said, the reason why it was necessary to discard any effort to do this thing diplomatically, and in their lights prompted them to do it with military force. May we have the next slide, please? Whoa, let's jump ahead now to just this past month. If you're looking for any further proof as to what NATO was up to, what the Germans and the French, and of course the US, you have to just look at what Jens Stoltenberg, Norwegian head of NATO, he's the Secretary General, he said, look, the war didn't start in February 2022. No. Since 2014. Remember, 2014 was when the coup occurred in Kiev, the most blatant coup in history, since it was advertised 2.5 weeks before on YouTube. That's another story. I hope you're familiar with that story. It's an incredible story. Okay, so the coup took place. And what are we saying here? We're saying, well, right after the coup, that's when we started training and equipping the armed forces of Ukraine so that they were much stronger in 2022, exactly what Angela Merkel conceded last December. Now, Stoltenberg, I don't know if he realizes how he puts his foot in his mouth, but he very proudly said, when was this? Just a month, a little less than a month ago, on September 7th of this year, he said, look, this is the way it went down. Putin didn't want NATO to enlarge anymore. He sent a draft treaty he wanted us to sign, and to promise that there would be no more NATO enlargement. That was a precondition to not invading Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that draft treaty. So he went to war to prevent more NATO close to his borders. And jocular Stoltenberg jests. He got just the opposite. Finland is joining, and Sweden will be joining too. So instead of wanting less NATO forces on his border, he got more. Aren't we tricky? Okay, so this is the background. Next one. Well, I want to point out a little change of pace here, that it isn't only shelling of Russian nationals in the Donbass. It isn't just the deception that was accorded to the Minsk Accords from 2015 until 2022. It was more. And you won't get this from the mainstream media, but these are the facts, folks. They're verified. I had a very, very talented physics professor named Ted Postel, professor emeritus, MIT, helped me with these slides. you'll see what's coming. So December 21st, 2021. That was the 2 months before the Russian troops went into the Donbass. Putin had a big meeting with his military. All the 4 stars were there, the defense minister Shoigu and all the others. He said, look, there are American MK-41 launchers already in Ukraine, in Romania, and soon in Poland. They're in Poland now, and they can launch offensive strike missiles. Whoa, offensive strike missiles already in Romania and soon to be in Poland. If US missiles are put in Ukraine, then the flight time to Moscow is only 7 to 10 minutes, or even just 5, count them, 5 minutes for hypersonic systems once the US gets them. Final comment from Putin: the US doesn't have hypersonic weapons yet, but we know when they will have them. And get this, folks, Putin says, he says to his generals and his defense minister, they will supply these hypersonic missiles to Ukraine. Next slide, please. So I asked Ted Postal, who knows an awful lot more about missiles and physics and all that kind of thing, to draw me a little map indicating what a generic ballistic missile, how long it would take to get from those sites in Poland on the top or Romania on the bottom to Moscow, let's say. Well, I hope you can read the distances. I prefer reading the minutes. The minutes are what? 10 minutes, 7 minutes, 9 minutes. The 7 minutes is from Kiev, right in the middle of Ukraine. Now, why is this a threat? Well, it's a threat because, as Putin said, once you put missiles, hypersonic missiles particularly, in these installations that already exist in Romania and Poland, and God forbid in Ukraine, says Putin, then I only have, 5 minutes to decide whether to blow up the rest of the world? I mean, he didn't say it that way, but that's what it amounts to, right? So just up here, you can see the distance between DC and Boston to give you an idea of how far that is. Now, to put this into some perspective and to show why it is that the Russians consider this to be an existential threat, I think we need to go back just 61 years, actually exactly 61 years, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was this week. It was this week that offensive strike missiles were found in Cuba. There was a lot of cloud cover, and there's a lot of excuses why our U-2 aircraft didn't find them before them, but they were in place there, and they were armed, armed with nuclear warheads. All right. Now, how do we know what they were? You don't have to be an imagery analyst to know what a signature is. Okay. We had so many signatures. We knew the configuration of SS-4 sites in the Soviet Union. We memorized it. Okay. So when we saw them in Cuba, we knew exactly. It was almost like they had a sign on, hey, this is an SS-4 missile site U-2 aircraft. Okay. Now, the SS-4s, where could they reach? I refer you to those concentric circles there. The first one indicates how far a Soviet bomber could have reached in those days, and that was not very far. The real threat was from these offensive strike missiles, specifically the SS-4, and you could see that could hit Washington and our naval bases and do a lot of damage. In how many minutes? Well, let's see what it say there. 9 minutes, 13 minutes. So do you see an analogy there? Okay. Now, the wider circle is for the SS-5s. Now, if you look in that little rectangle in the corner of the slide, you can see that there was a blockade there. blockades are illegal. So so Obama called it a quarantine. Okay, there was a quarantine, and that was put in place just in time to prevent the SS-5 missiles from arriving in Cuba. But the SS-4s were there, the nuclear warheads were there. We were asked, that is we, I had just joined the CIA a year later, but my former colleagues were asked, are these missiles armed? And to their credit, they said, look, it makes no sense to fire these missiles if they're not armed. You have to assume that some of them at least are armed with nuclear warheads. 30 years later, we found out that was exactly the case. Many of them were already armed. So what's my point here? Well, my point is that John Kennedy, who is the man that drew me down to Washington in the first place, John Kennedy said this is an existential threat to us. He talked with Khrushchev. It was teletype in those days, but it worked. I mean, they were talking, right? And he said, look, you have to withdraw those missiles. And he made a public threat to not shy away from nuclear war or invasion of Cuba, much less the illegal quarantine, so to speak. And so what did Khrushchev do? And long story short, he turned around to his military generals and said, you know, it was a good try, nothing ventured, nothing gained, but this is no existential threat to us. Let's get out of Dodge. So he withdrew the missiles in exchange for an open pledge on the part of Kennedy not to invade Cuba, and a subtle pledge by Brother Bobby not to take missiles out of Turkey, which were similar offensive strike missiles. So what's the bottom line here? We knew that this was an existential threat to us. It was not one to Russia. We did things that John Kennedy did things that were illegal, right? And so did anyone say to John Kennedy, Mr. President, you are overreacting. You can't do dubiously legal things like quarantines. I mean, and by the way, Mr. Kennedy, every state has a sovereign right to choose its partners and its allies. And if Cuba wants to have offensive strike missiles from Russia and Cuba, well, that's not against the law, Mr. Kennedy. I think you're overreacting. You shouldn't do these illegal things. Now, how many people said that? I don't know. I don't know if anybody said that. I think even Khrushchev was aware of the real set of things here. And so the Russians ducked out. Now, the analogy, of course, is that we have offensive strike missiles of the SS-4 type in Romania and in Poland. And we said, that is, Putin said, when the US gets hypersonic missiles go, remember, for some of you people are almost as old as I am, remember Mach? An aircraft that going Mach, that's the speed of sound, right? Mach 2, Mach 2, whoa! These go at Mach 8, 9, 10. There is no defense against them, okay? So put yourself in Mr. Putin's place. And what he said in the last slide was simply, the US will give hypersonic missiles to Ukraine when the US has successfully developed them. Next slide, please. Okay, now what happened? I indicated that that was the 21st of December, 2021, when Putin made that speech to his top military. And you had just, 10 days, 9 days later, Biden gets a call from Putin. And Putin says, look, the Kremlin calls and says to the White House, look, Mr. Putin wants to talk to Mr. Biden, like right away. And they were flummoxed. I mean, they had already agreed to have strategic talks on nuclear forces in Geneva on the 9th and 10th of January. So the White House said, well, wait a second. Why does it have to be right now? And Putin said, please, right now. Now, to his credit, Biden accepted the call, wasn't quite ready for it. What happened? Well, Biden, the readout of this conversation said that when Putin remonstrated about these worries in specifics, the notion that the US would give hypersonic missiles to Ukraine, put them in canisters such as the ones in Romania and Poland, canisters where you can't really see what kind of missiles is in there. It's not like a SS4 signature, okay? When Putin made that complaint, Biden said, Washington, don't worry, Washington has no intention of deploying offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Whoa! New Year's Eve, the next day, Ushakov, chief aide to Putin on these matters, rejoices. He says, whoa, wow, Moscow has, these are one of the goals that Moscow hoped to achieve in the security guarantees we've been asking from the US and from NATO. Actually, when I looked at the treaties, the draft treaties that I mentioned before, that were given to the US and NATO, what Stoltenberg mentioned before, the provisions in those treaties indicate that 5 of the 8 articles in those draft treaties were addressed in one way or another by this undertaking not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. As I say, there was rejoicing. As I say, 9 days later, they got to Geneva to start the talks between the US and the Russian delegations. Next slide, please. Whoa, hopes dashed? Well, actually, it seems that our delegation that was sent to Geneva had no instructions to talk about offensive strike missiles and not putting them in Ukraine. No instructions, so it was off the table. They wouldn't talk about it, nor would they talk about NATO not enlarging itself to include Ukraine. Whoa, how do I know that? Well, the two, Biden and Putin, talked again on February 12th. So we're talking December 30th, February 12th. So what's that, 6 weeks or so? Ushakov, the same fellow who was rejoicing on New Year's Eve, he reports that the Biden-Putin telephone call, he described it this way. He said it was follow-up to the December 30 call where Biden made that undertaking. And what Ushakov said was, whoops, this time, quote, Biden didn't really address the central key elements of Russia's initiatives, either with regard to the non-expansion of NATO or with regard to the non-deployment of strike weapon systems on Ukrainian territory. To these items, we have received no meaningful response. Whoa, talk about hope stashed. Next slide, please. Okay, I think to put this into some perspective, one has to realize that way back when President Clinton was toying with the idea of expanding NATO, despite the promise made to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, his foreign minister, not to do this, not 1 inch to the east, George Kennan, the most respected Sovietologist ever, was just really distraught. And what he said in a New York Times op-ed going back to 97, when all this stuff started to begin, when they started bringing in these people into NATO right on Russia's border, he said, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-war post-Cold War era. Why? With all the hopeful possibilities engendered by the end of the Cold War, why should East-West relations become centered on the question of who should be allied with whom, and by implication, who should be allied against whom, in some fanciful, totally unforeseeable, and most improbable future military conflict? Well, suffice it to say that his advice and the advice of many others, Ambassador Matlock, a whole slew of people, they went ahead and they did this, okay? And so we're faced with a situation now where people are not only happy that they did it, but bragging about it. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, before we go into the nitty-gritty, and this will only take another 5 minutes, here's Professor John Mearsheimer. Now, I didn't know that I was a member of the realist school of international relations, but I was, and I am still. I mean, you look at the facts, right? The real facts, and you try to put them together and make sense out of them. If that's what, I don't know what the alternative is, frankly. I'm not an academic, all right? So here's what Mearsheimer said. September 2014, just a few months after the coup that removed the relatively pro-Russian government in Ukraine, substituting these folks that came in and said, we're going to join NATO, and we're going to not let Russians speak their own language. So, Mearsheimer, this is the foreign affairs piece that he wrote. He also made a speech at the time, which the last time I checked had about 35 million with an M views, okay? Why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault. The liberal delusions that provoked Putin. It was in Foreign Affairs. The US and NATO now face a choice on Ukraine. They can continue their current policy, which will exacerbate hostilities with Russia and devastate Ukraine in the process. This is September 2014, folks. 2023 minus 2, well, that's 9 years ago. They can continue their current policy, which will devastate Ukraine in the process, or they can switch gears and work to create a prosperous but neutral Ukraine. May 22nd, 2023 now, so more recently. Here's what he said to the Committee for the Republic. I think that Putin, with great reluctance, invaded Ukraine. I do not think he had any other options. He was deeply committed to the Minsk agreement. Remember Minsk, Hollande, and Merkel? The Minsk agreement, because he wanted to shut down the conflict in the Donbass so that he would not have to invade. John Mearsheimer, completely consistent with what he had said 9 years previous. Now, not to bore you, but I'd like to bring you up to date with 2 more slides. And may we have the next one, please? Okay, now, somebody asked me, do I agree with John Mearsheimer that the whole Ukraine imbroglio is the fault of the West? And I said, yeah. And I said, don't you blame Putin? I said, well, I'm happy to blame Putin, but, you know, I think this was 105% the fault of the West. Now somebody says, oh, McGovern, where did you come up with 105%? Well, I'm about to show you the extra 5%. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, they did it with a limited force, and they were pretty choosy in not hitting civilian targets. What they want to do is read the riot act to the Zelensky government and say, look, we're serious. We want you to knock it off. We don't want you to keep shelling our folks in the Donbass. and we want to have an agreement short of war. What happened? Well, okay. 5 months into the war, I'm sorry, shouldn't 5 months. Yeah, well, let's see. No, it's 5 weeks, for God's sake. Sorry, I got that all mixed up. It's 5 weeks. So this thing started on the 24th of February. And on the 31st of March, after meeting in Belarus and then in Istanbul, the Ukrainians on one hand and the Russians on the other came to an agreement. Now, what happens to that agreement? Well, it was sabotage. By whom? By the West. How do we know that? The Russians say it. How do the Russians say it? That would not be quite persuasive, would it? The Ukrainians say it. Ukrainskaya pravda. Okay, here's what it said. The headline: possibility of Zelensky-Putin talks came to a halt after British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's visit to Kiev. Again, Ukrainska pravda. Johnson appeared almost without warning in Kiev on April 9th. So 10 days after this agreement was initialed. His message: look, you don't negotiate with an evil guy like Putin. Even if Ukraine is ready to sign agreements with Putin, we're not. Whoa, who's in charge here? Ukrainskaya pravda again. The Russian side, this is a quote, the Russian side was actually ready for the Zelensky-Putin meeting, end quote. Okay. Boris Johnson goes home to London. 3 days later, Putin gets up and laments the fact that the talks with Ukraine had turned into a dead end. Now, people say, how can you take Putin's word for it? Well, how about the word of some Russophobes? Would that be more persuasive? Now, when I talk about Russophobes, I'm talking about people like Fiona Hill and others. I had a quote from her here. I can't find it right now, but it shows how they've been trained to hate Russia. I mean, Professor Pipes, Richard Pipes up in Harvard, has a great retinue of folks like Professor Hill, like Professor Stent, who wrote an article in Foreign Affairs a year ago. We learned of it in August of last year. It was published September, October in the flagship Foreign Affairs. And what she said was, what they said, Russia would, under this deal, Russia would withdraw to its position on February 23. Whoa, okay. February 23, when it controlled part of the Donbass region and all of Crimea. And in exchange, Ukraine would promise not to seek NATO membership and instead would receive certain security guarantees from a number of countries. Okay, so that was the deal. Now, last June 2023, at a meeting with African, actually many of them presidents, prime ministers, very senior African officials, for whatever reason, he dug out the text of this treaty, waved it around and said, look, here it was initialed. It was all set to go. We had it all together. And he explained the terms of the treaty exactly the same as Russophobes, Hill, and Stent explained it. So that's why, I guess that's why I said that the West was 105% responsible for the mess that happened there. Now, in concluding, I simply say that these are the facts as I see them. We intelligence analysts were not prone to moralize. We figured out what the facts meant, and we told policymakers what we saw. And so there it is. That's what I and many of my colleagues, so I still trust all of them out of government now, that those are the conclusions we came to. And when a very distinguished article was published in the New York Times, full-page article, a terrific article explaining the background of Ukraine, and with a diagram showing the missiles, such as they are, threatening Russia. I was asked to sign that, but there was a phrase in there that I objected to, and it said, well, certainly Putin had other options. And so I asked some of the signers, who are good friends of mine, former colleagues. I said, okay, all right, what were the other options? I'm willing to learn. And actually, they didn't come up with much that was very perceptive. So what I did was write an article saying, I don't think that Putin had any other options, that he had pretty much tried the negotiation route, that there's good reason for him to have felt diddled, as we say in the Bronx, and that's why we're at the point where we are now. And I think, and what was it? Julian Assange, one of the people I love most and a good friend of mine. He said, if wars can be started by lies, they can be ended by the truth. And what I've spoken here is my truth. And I think that if this was spread around, if Americans were brought to realize their responsibility for what's happened here, they would see that people like Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, who rises up and says, I rise to applaud the Ukrainians for fighting this fight for us. We don't have to, none of our troops are at risk. They're doing a great job for us. This is the cheapest war that we've ever fought. They would see through that and say, this is pretty cynical, and they would stop it. We're at a juncture now where it can be stopped. The alternatives are escalation or coming to our senses. The Ukrainians have lost their counteroffensive. It's blown up. There's no more counteroffensive. Whoever advised President Biden to say a couple of months ago, Russia has already lost, or advised the head of the CIA to say, oh, not only has Russia already lost, but the ineptitude of their military has been laid bare for the world to see. Those people are delusional. And the problem is that the policies that they help to inform are equally delusional. So right now, we need to rally what we have in terms of people who are apprised of the correct facts, and make sure that our senators, our representatives hear from us and prevent further escalation of this war. Because, as we can talk later, nuclear weapons are not out of the question now. And in 6 decades of watching this kind of thing, I'm more scared than I ever have been before that somebody stupid or somebody crazy or somebody by inadvertence will start something that will mean the death of all of us. On that happy note, I'll say that's it.
For some reason, I just became the host. I'm trying to figure out if we lost Anne. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Most welcome.
But it's an inappropriate time for that to have happened. I'm just looking to see who's in the meeting. Let's see here. So I guess I literally have to go to another meeting. It's an interesting meeting on money and banking. But is there someone here that I can designate as a co-host that can take my place. Ray, I don't know if you are a co-host, but I should make you one. Let's see. That would give you the power of running the meeting. Okay. Okay, so you're any other volunteer to be a co-host? Harry, can you help out? Harry Targ?
Really reluctant. I'm really not tech savvy.
Well, okay.
I can help out.
Anyway,
Ray, a
it-
question.
yeah. Well, you could keep a stack. Harry, could you moderate and keep a stack of questions?
I can help
Uh,
out.
Oh, it
Oh,
looks like Peace Action came back in, so we might be okay now.
But
Hey, Ray.
There's no picture on the screen,
Yeah, okay,
the big screen.
this is not my computer. Does anyone know how to get the picture from here onto? I know it should be on.
Why do
It
we
should
care
be.
about a picture?
Yeah, your projector thing isn't working.
Projector.
So Ray, I had a question. What about the Ukrainian people? I mean, they must be getting tired. And I heard something to the effect like 200,000 or 300,000 men left the Ukraine to avoid the war. So that's a question. And then I think we have another question from the audience too. Pass.
Well,
Okay,
I didn't hear that question.
Can you hear me?
I can. Was that a question you would like me to answer?
Well, I have a different question, but you
Oh,
can
yeah.
answer Tom's question about if the Ukrainians are getting tired. Then we have another question.
Yeah, let's go ahead and answer Tom's question if you could, Ray.
About the Ukrainians getting tired.
Yeah, well,
No, I mean, could they stop the war? Could they actually have their own peace movement and stop the war?
can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, the Ukrainians don't matter. The Kiev authorities are what are running things, and they are taking orders from Washington. So the notion that 400, I mean, these numbers are mind-boggling. 400 to 500,000 people have been killed or desperately wounded. I mean, that boggles the imagination. And so, for what purpose? I think that we have the ability to stop this war. It's not, as President Biden says, Putin's choice to stop this war. Remember, he considers it to be an existential threat. I happen to believe that Putin thinks his first obligation is to protect Russia. You saw those missiles, or I tried to tell you that story. You saw the shelling statistics. There are other things that I could have cited. And he was, in my view, a paragon of patience as he let himself be diddled on the Minsk Accords. Now, just so you remember, Angela Merkel said in December of this past year to Die Zeit, a weekly German, one of the main weekly German newspapers, look, this was just a delaying tactic. The Ukrainians needed time to build up their forces, and look at them now, December 2022. And Hollande in France said the same thing later. So you saw that picture of Putin sitting with Hollande and Merkel. I want to put a little caption under there, but that would be disingenuous. I mean, how do the Russians think about being diddled? I tell you, Putin is under pressure from those who say, look, Vladimir, you should have said, okay, Donetsk, okay, Luhansk, come on in with Crimea. They're up to no good out there. They're going to shell you forever. We don't trust them. Come on in. We're going to make you parts of Russia now. Now, Was that ideal? Of course it wasn't ideal. Would it have been more practical? It would have. And so when I think one of my slides said, finally, Putin acknowledges that finally a much delayed decision to take care of the people in Donbass, much delayed. Yeah, 7 years, count them, 7 years being diddled. So, this is the reality that you won't find on MSNBC or in any of the major media, so to speak. And it needs to be understood by Americans so that we can change it and we can put an end to this terrible, terrible, attrition that is happening to every Ukrainian young man or old. They're drafting people almost as old as I am, for God's sake. It's really pretty awful. And it needs to stop. And the people around Biden need to get some good sense in them and say, all right, we need to pull back, because like Cuba, Putin considers our activities here to be an existential threat to Russia. Like Cuba, Khrushchev drew back. Now, am I making an analogy here between Putin and John Kennedy? My God, how could I do that? The circumstances were similar. These comparisons should be instructive, and I'm not afraid to make them. So, so let's have the next question.
Okay, now go. Art.
Ray, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
My name is Art. I don't disagree with anything you presented tonight, but there is at least one additional narrative which many people are influenced by or find compelling, and that is that Putin has characterized Ukraine as really being nothing different than Russia, and doesn't recognize Ukraine as a viable, independent, sovereign nation, and that if we don't stop him wherever we're supposedly stopping him, he'll be going on to rebuild the old Russian Empire to at least the size of the Soviet Union. So, what do you think of that narrative?
Well, if you go back just about 12 centuries in history, you'll realize that the Slavic peoples in that area of Europe, or in and around Kiev, were very, very, very intelligent people. They had an epic poetry that rivals the Odyssey and the Iliad. One such poem was called the Slovo o Polku Igorevye, but they had no way to write it down. Can you imagine? They had no alphabet. And so these priests from Macedonia went up and they really liked these Slavic people. So these people need to be able to write down their literature and so forth. And so they constructed an alphabet for them. They used what Greek letters they could, Latin letters, a couple of Hebrew letters. And they had to manufacture some letters like Shah, okay? That gave the Kievan authorities, which was the primary start of Russia, the ability to flourish. And flourish they did for a couple of centuries until Genghis Khan came in from the east, occupied Russia for 2 centuries and 40 years, okay? So when we're coming out of the Dark Ages in Europe, the Russians are just then throwing off what they call the Tatarskaya Iga, the Tartar yoke, okay? And they finally start building a Russia, and what happens? In come the Swedes, the Lithuanians, the Hanseatic League, and they invade Russia. It takes Peter the Great until 1720 or so to get rid of those guys. And Peter the Great says, okay, now we're going to turn to the West. And turn to the West they did. The Russians have considered themselves since then a very integral part of Europe. Now, what happened next? Oh, you got Napoleon coming in, 1812. And oh, you got Hitler coming in, 1941. Well, you know, so they have this history, these Russians. How many people did they lose in World War II? Some of you may know that the figures are 26 million with an M, okay? That's both troops and people. How many US soldiers perished in World War II? About 430, 440,000, okay? Was the United States demolished by World War II? No. Was Russia? Yes. Were the Russians thankful for our helping them beat the Germans back? Yes, and I can prove that. I'm going to tell you one little vignette which should speak volumes. I was in Moscow about 7, 8 years ago, celebrating the meeting on the Elbe, the meeting where Russian forces, Soviet forces, and US forces met on that river in Germany, okay, at the end of World War II. And I recited a poem and made a little speech, and this Soviet general in a Soviet army uniform, about 6'3", comes up to me and he, real close, and he says, Studebaker, Studebaker, Studebaker. And he puts his arms out and he gives me this big Russian bear hug. You know? And I said, whoa. Now, for those of you too young to know this, Studebaker factories in Indiana turned their whole automaking production facilities over to making what we in the Army call deuce and a halfs, okay? 2.5 ton trucks. What could they do? They could travel over any kind of terrain. They could pull artillery. They were the ones that went in through Iran in to help General Abramov, the guy who was giving me the big hug. And what he remembered about Americans was Studebaker, Studebaker. Would the Russians have won the war without Lend-Lease? People debate that. I kind of think they would. It would take another year or two. But nevertheless, we were allies then. And as John Kennedy said early on, these two countries, the US and Russia, are maybe unique in the world among major powers that have never had a real serious conflict one with the other. You can dismiss the US invasions during the Russian Revolution as minor incursions, okay? So there's a lot in common here, the more so where we share a joint interest in preventing nuclear war and in preventing our grandchildren from having, well, preventing our grandchildren from lacking clean water and clean air. And I'd like to tack on that I like to speak, or I don't like to speak, but I always try to mention what I call the mother of all opportunity costs. And that is called Ukraine. Not only are our armed forces spewing more and more stuff into the air, but the whole world has its attention diverted at a time when it's absolutely necessary to combine forces. It can't be just one country, got to be everybody. So our children and our grandchildren have a decent chance to live on a planet that can support them. So, you know, Ukraine is bad enough. The implications for the longer haul, because of this diversion of attention, are even more evil in my view.
Ray, maybe my question wasn't clear enough. I don't think you quite answered whether, I'll break it down in two parts. Do you consider Ukraine to be an independent sovereign nation to begin with?
Thanks for calling me on that. Of course, it's a separate country, and there's not one scintilla of evidence that Putin or others felt otherwise. Now, Putin made one speech, which has been misinterpreted to say, aha, look, he thinks the Ukrainians belong to Russia. Nothing could be farther from the case. What he's trying to say is, look, Ukrainians are our cousins, okay? We grew out of them from Kiev. We've always been pretty fraternal until last couple of decades, okay? We can get back to that, but realize that we're the same stock, we're the same Slavic stock. Belarus is the same way. Even the Poles are Slavic based. So that has been. You can misinterpret what Putin says if you have like Fiona Hill and others, reason to do that. But that speech that has been cited as saying, "Oh, he doesn't think Ukraine should be a separate country," that's bogus. That inference or that implication is bogus in my view.
Second part of your question.
Well, he answered it.
Thank you, Ray. We apologize. We're having some technical difficulties. Our screen is blank now, except on the computer. You're fine on the computer, and it's still recording. But our audience here only can see you on our little computer screen rather than on the big screen in the room.
It's okay.
But are there other questions?
Yes.
Oh, okay. You want to come up and speak closer to the microphone here? It's on the table. It's that round thing.
Oh, that's it, okay.
And state your name.
I will indeed do that. I'll do more than that. I'll do more than that because, Ray, this is Gary Shellman. We spent a couple of days together back in 2005 when you were our great decision speaker. I don't know if you remember coming to Milwaukee.
I do.
And you were very gracious. My wife was having her knee replaced at the time, but we still managed to spend several presentations of yours, and I was able to interview you on our little television station. So it's good to hear from you. I thought you did a very nicely documented presentation, but I have a couple of questions for you. Number one is a trick question. Why is the Russian parliament called the Duma and the Ukrainian parliament called the Rada?
Well, Duma is the word for think in Russian, in Russian, okay, Duma. So the Duma comes from that, I'm quite sure. Now the Rada, I don't know how the Ukrainians come to the word Rada to describe their parliament. Does anyone else know? Why do you ask?
It looks like they're muted.
No, I can hear you now.
That room needs to unmute.
Okay, sorry, Ray. We somehow ended up being muted. So you want to start again, please?
Okay, well, my trick question was, Rada comes from a failed revolution, but a concession the Tsar made to giving the Imperial Russia its first parliament, more or less. And Rada was the name that the Ukrainians chose in 1918 to call their parliament when they broke from the Tsar and then were later suppressed by Stalin's forces that pulled down. So today, the parliament in Kiev is Rada. Am I correct?
Right.
And the parliament in Moscow is Duma.
Right. The lower house.
You know more Russian than I do, but okay. Then my other question is a hypothetical. If in 2014, if you were the prime minister of Lithuania after the occupation of Crimea on one hand by Russia and Georgia, a portion of Georgia on the other hand, who would you trust more, Stoltenberg or Putin?
It's hard to be a Lithuanian, I tell you. Lithuanians hate Russians. So, true to form, I'd have to hate Putin, but else I wouldn't be a loyal Lithuanian. Remember, Lithuania occupied broad stretches of Russian territory in the 16th century. And the Russians don't forget that. Every school girl and boy in Russia remembers that. So anyhow, if that was another trick question, I probably flunked that as well.
Same could be said for Poland and other countries that had rather bad experiences with Russia. And I'll even throw in Finland.
Could you say that one more time? I'm not getting it.
The same could be for Poland and other NATO countries, and I'll throw in Finland at the end.
For NATO, for Poland, other NATO countries, and what else? Finland. Oh, okay,
Well,
Finland. Yeah,
for trusting Stoltenberg or Putin.
yeah.
I got
Stoltenberg or Putin? Well, if you're talking about the governments, it's Stoltenberg because they have thrown their lot in with NATO. Talking about the people, well, that's a mixed bag. There are many Russian nationals in places like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania as well. So it's really kind of a mixed thing. There's no real reason why people can't get together and sort these things out. That's the way we used to do things. Even, when you're nostalgia for the days of Ronald Reagan, for God's sake, when we talk to the Russians, when we listen to Gorbachev, when we destroyed a whole class of intermediate range and medium range ballistic missiles already emplaced in Europe, Russian side of Europe, the Persian IIs in our side, we destroyed all those. Scott Ritter, my good friend, was one of the inspectors that went up to Novotkinsk, where they built some of these things, and was one of the inspectors. They were verified. We learned to doveraj, no proveraj. Trust, but verify. I never thought that a whole class of ballistic missiles could be destroyed, but they were, because there was a measure of trust between Ronald Reagan and then George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev. So these things are possible, but you can't have people who have other ambitions, namely to give Russia a substantial blow, or as our defense secretary said, to weaken Russia. Here is Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, about 18 months ago. We are going to move heaven and earth to weaken Russia. That's what Ukraine is all about. That's why Ukrainian citizens, the poor people who are perishing in this war, they're being used as pawns. And when people brag about that, like Senator Blumenthal that I meant before, or that fellow who heads the Republicans, McConnell, and he said, "Oh, we haven't lost one person. It's just a lot of money. We got the money, and we're borrowing it from the Chinese. We never have to pay it back." It's crazy. So we need to call people on these things.
Ray, my name is Tom Seary, and I have a scenario that I want to suggest to you. If I were Putin, given 1963, I'd start talking to Cuba. I'd start talking to Cuba because the deal we had, Kennedy had, take the missiles out of Turkey, take the missiles out of Cuba. Well, now our side, the U.S. side, is putting missiles in where? Romania and Poland. Putting missiles in, not Turkey. We didn't put any in Turkey. So if I were Putin, I'd start fixing up my relationship with Cuba. I'd get back to 1963 all over again. What's your thoughts?
Well, in my view, Putin is a very circumspect, a very considered politician. He doesn't raise threats that are likely to redound to his detriment. That may come. I mean, Cuba still has the right to ask for Russian missiles, but that would be seen as so provocative that I think it would sort of, that I think Putin would be out of character to do that kind of thing. He doesn't need to do that kind of thing. He's not worried. He's not worried about that kind of thing. He's worried about the ones that are already in Ukraine. I mean, already in Romania and Poland. Now, this thing about Ukraine, are they going to be put in Ukraine? Well, you can see from what I said before that Putin was really worried about that, right? He told his top military, oh, they're going to get supersonic and hypersonic missiles, and then going to give them to the Ukrainians. December 21, 2021. 9 days later, there's a conversation between Biden and Putin at Putin's request, and Biden, the readout said, we have no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Now, what happened? Now I'm in the realm of speculation. I think what happened was on New Year's Eve, Biden woke up and he had Blinken and Sullivan at his side, and they said, Mr. President, you didn't promise that, did you? You didn't tell Putin that. And Biden said, well, he seemed real upset about it. So, yeah, I thought we'd get the negotiations off to a good start. Forget about it, Mr. President. Forget about it. And the negotiators in Geneva, who met 10 days later, forgot about it. Now, there are lots of grievances that Putin have. There are some strategic dangers that he thought more important than others. That was one of them. And if you put yourself in Putin's position, do you want these kinds of missiles in places like not only Romania, Poland, but look at the map. Ukraine is much closer. Now, one thing that I really didn't give a lot of emphasis to is the fact that these missile emplacements, these canisters, okay, they were first built for Aegis ships, okay, and so they can accommodate cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles, anti-submarine missiles, and God knows what else. They're all really big to accommodate these things. Now, I thought that the ones in Poland and Romania, it would be dug into the ground, you could kind of see what's there, but no. They're standing up. They're vertical, okay? The only trouble is they're capped. And so the Russians don't know what kind of missiles are in there. They could be cruise missiles and offensive missiles. And eventually they could be hypersonic missiles. Now, I asked my technical friends, my military friends, now, how difficult is it to change from what they call anti-ballistic missiles or anti-ship missiles to an offensive strike missiles? How long would it take? And the answer was half an hour. Come on, half an hour. Yeah, you get a CD. You don't even need a DVD, for God's sake. You get a CD, you put it into your computer, you change the targeting, and you got an offensive threat from eventually a hypersonic missile. Now, Putin knows that. He said it. Point is, I had it verified by physicists and by people who know a lot about such missiles in our own country.
Thank you, Ray. Is there anyone on the Zoom who has a question? We've had, I think, 3 questions from the audience here.
I think Michael Howie had a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I had just saw something on TV about Cuba, that there's some Cubans that were promised work over in Russia or in Ukraine, helping to build some of the territories. And then they were saying that they got sent to the front lines, that they were kind of baited and switched in their job opportunities. So apparently Cuba is part of the equation there in Russia.
I'm familiar with those reports, but I never really felt that they had much weight behind them. Maybe I just haven't looked into them carefully enough. But in the grand equation, the Cuban troops or whatever they are wouldn't make much difference. There are an awful lot of volunteer people in Ukraine already.
The Cuban government has said they would not allow anything like that, and they would prosecute anyone who was involved in transferring people into
They-
that situation.
Dale Lehman with a question in Chicago. There's a lot of people with real concern, you amongst them, about the increasing potential of a nuclear war, nuclear exchange, that there is a great instability. We've had more than 10 years of the Russians stating that they would respond with violence if pushed beyond the red line regarding the advance of NATO. They were ignored. Eventually, they were pushed and they responded with that kind of violence. Since the war has started and the Russians have seen that they're not fighting the Ukrainians really, they're killing them and being killed by them, but it's really the United States and NATO and predominantly the United States and the weapons makers and investment bankers in this country that are driving that war for access, open access to Ukrainian territory and minerals. The result has been an unlimited effort to attack Russian stability. The U.S. has said as much. They want to break up Russia and open it up to investment. There have been statements over the last 4 or 5 months that from the Russians, it may be necessary to use a tactical nuclear weapon. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I've heard it stated at least twice, not frequently, but at least twice. There's a warning there. They have seen that the U.S. did its best to impose a very racist, fascist government, a Nazi-supported government in Ukraine to take over the government and ultimately become the spearhead in the attacks on Lugansk and the other and Donbass. Ahead of the invasion of the special operation, Putin stated that one of the reasons he was doing it is in response to what happened in Odessa. Remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. And if you've seen the footage of what happened and the way the Ukrainian government allowed it to happen and murderous brutality, that to me indicated that there was a profound awareness of the depths of violence that had been organized with the help of the United States to create the nationalist hatred that has been denied for so long, although it's hard to deny it. So you've got the Russians saying now they might have to use a nuclear weapon in order to bring senses into the West, which is fueling this conflagration and destabilizing the world in multiple ways. Go.
So let me talk about the nuclear aspect, okay? The Russians have a declared policy. They will use nuclear weapons if their homeland is threatened, if nuclear weapons are used against them, okay? Now, what are the chances that Russia will feel it necessary to use a nuclear weapon? I would say they're almost nil. Why? Because Russia is winning.
That's true. But
Now, what are the chances that the United States would use a mini nuke? Well, let me take you through this. We ran out of shells, 155 millimeter shells for howitzers, for tanks. I mean, I trained with those same shells. It had been standard for 60 years, okay? How is it that NATO and the United States ran out of basic shells for artillery and other weaponry? You know why? Because Russia was no threat. There wasn't going to be any war in Europe. Russia had fallen apart, okay? There wasn't even a rhetorical claim that Russia wanted to take over Ukraine or anything else, okay? When did that change? 2014, okay? When we overthrew the government. And you know the rest of the story. My point is simply this. We're out of shells. That's a big lesson. People should realize that that means that Russia was not a threat to anybody in NATO, okay? Now, after 2014, did we build up our capacity to build up 155 millimeter more? No, we didn't. Why? Because Russia's still not a threat. You know, we can handle them, okay? Here's the scenario. These guys, Sullivan and Blinken, who never had a uniform on, who don't know the first thing about military policy, they come to Biden 3 months ago, and Biden says, hey, I hear that the Ukrainians are running out of shells for their 155 millimeter howitzers. Let's give them some of ours. And Blinken says, well, let me get Defense Secretary Austin in here. Lloyd, the president has a question. Let's give some of our 155 millimeter shells to them. Well, sir, we don't have any. I mean, we have some, but we're really low on them. We can't give them any more. President, what do we got? Well, Mr. President, we have we have this, on the bottom shelf here, we have cluster munitions. We can use that. They fit the 155, and 110 countries have banned them, but we're exceptional. We can use them, and maybe we'll get our factories up and running. Yeah, let's use the cluster munition. Now, cluster munitions are being used now. The Russians are also using cluster munitions. What happens when the Russians can produce more cluster munitions than NATO or the US? What happens? These guys go to Biden and they say, Mr. President, we're running out of cluster munitions, but up on this top shelf here with the combination lock on it, those are the mini nukes. Now, we might have to use these mini nukes. And Mr. President, I'll tell you why. The Russians are winning. An election year is coming. The Congress and a lot of the people are very, very upset with a bunch of us for what we've done in Ukraine. We need something to change the tenor of these things. And besides, Mr. President, you know, you're going to be impeached, or impeachment process is underway. And, Mr. President, your son, he's been indicted. And, they've shown that Blinken, your Secretary of State, that he was the guy that set and trained this operation by 51 senior intelligence managers that said Hunter Biden's laptop had all the earmarks of a Russian disinformation operation, okay? Now, that, of course, was a lie, but it helped you win the election. Now, what are we going to do this time? We need something to help us win the election. If we don't win the election, let's say, worst case, that fellow with the red hair gets in there. My God. Well, Mr. President, we could all end up in jail. They've got the evidence on it. Now, think about that. Think about the extra incentive that these people, I don't use adjectives for Blinken, Nod, and Sullivan, that these people have to avoid losing the election, to avoid bearing the opprobrium that comes from this misadventure in Ukraine, even though US soldiers haven't been lost. I mean, don't they care? 500,000? 400,000? My God. So anyhow, what I'm picturing is a real possible situation where, to turn things around, these guys will say, well, we'll go to, I know the combination to those mini nukes. Let's use, we just use one of them and maybe those Russians will take us seriously for once. Could that happen? I think that's far more likely than for the Russians to use a nuclear weapon first. And I think there are some crazy 4-star generals and admirals that think we could get away with it, just as John Kennedy had to contend with back 61 years ago. He overcame them. You know what happened to him at the end. But could Biden overcome these guys? There's no indication at all that Biden is running this ship. These guys will call the shots, and that's what scares me the most when it comes to nuclear weapons.
Great. Are there any other questions from people? Steve Watros has a question here. Steve, that is what's going to be picking up your voice, that little circular thing over there.
Very good. Hi, Ray. You helped out at a statewide Zoom we had a while back about Ukraine. I have a question. The president has proposed $24 billion more for the war effort in Ukraine. Some people, some in this room, some in the Republican Party are thinking that's not the way to go. And the people that are in favor of it, they're saying, well, if we don't do that, then Russia will either run over Ukraine and onward to Poland and etc., or that there'll be if there's a ceasefire, it'll be frozen in place and Ukraine will lose a third of its territory, and those would be the worst possible things. But what's your recommendation on how this could end in the most reasonable possible way?
Well, I think all the evidence suggests that Putin's purposes are measured and that they're finite. With respect to Polish fears, I know about history. I know why the Poles might be fearful, okay? But if they're really fearful of a Russian invasion, why do they not have 155 millimeter shells for their howitzers? Yeah, look, there was a peace in Europe when the Soviet Union fell apart. Nobody had a credible enemy in Russia, not until we overthrew the government in Kiev. Even then, the Poles, the Ukrainians, much less the rest of the West, didn't think that they needed to build 155 millimeter shells. So the Poles, I think, are more concerned than the others. But look what's happened just yesterday, and this is really important. The president of Poland, he said outwardly that Ukraine is kind of drowning, it's drowning. And, we'd like to help it, but, when you try to help a drowning person, they can pull you down and you can drown too. So we're not going to give any more arms support to Ukraine. Oh, you talk about internal cohesion of NATO? Well, that doesn't sound like cohesion to me. And what we're going to encounter over the next couple of months is Europe will face a winter where they're paying 4 or 5 times as much money as they have previously for gas and oil to heat their homes, and where industry, particularly in Germany, is imploded and going elsewhere for cheaper energy. And who are people going to blame on that? Well, interestingly enough, and here's a vignette. One of my doctors, dermatologist, he knows what I do, and he watches my stuff, and he says, Ray, he said, look, looks like the Ukrainians blew up the pipeline. And when I think, I said, that's BS. And he wasn't quite finished grabbing the stuff off my skin, so I should have been a little bit more careful. But it's BS. It's BS. We know who blew up that pipeline. The German people, by and large, know who blew up that pipeline. The government doesn't want to admit it, but what's happening in Germany is the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, the rightist party, is garnering more and more support because they are saying these things out loud, okay? They have become the second most powerful party, for God's sake. Whoa, what does that mean? That means that there's a lot of stuff going on in Europe, and it won't be very long before, as a result of the Ukrainian debacle, some leaders will come in who can think for themselves. I've been saying, Germany, 77 plus years after the war, should be able to stand up on its own 2 feet. I've been saying that for too long. I still hope that they will. And if they won't now, with their major pipeline blown up credibly by U.S. Cy Hirsch has the whole story. If they won't stand up now, then they become the sheepish, submissive Germans described by a German lawyer in Berlin in 1933, when he said that was the condition. The Germans just couldn't stand up. They couldn't find it in their heart or their soul to stand up to the abuses that were going on. I would hope that 2 generations later, maybe they can, maybe they'll be forced to. We'll have to see, but this is going to all play out within the next year, in my view.
That's very true.
So,
Ray,
oh, Jack, go ahead. Jack, go ahead.
I think we have one more question, and then I know Jim. Well, first of all, thank you, Ray. You have a cold. I know you're starting a cold, and we kept you on for over an hour and a half. But we'll have one more question, and then I think Jim Carpenter is going to have some things to say.
Well, I get time for this, don't I? I mean, don't I get time?
Okay, my question, Jack Bertol, is the fact that the discussions continually deal with the potential for nuclear war. It deals with the expense of the military government. It's cost us a lot of weapons. But there's another dimension that is also talked about in some circles. And that has to do with Putin personally. That we know there's one group that calls him a sociopath, that you can't negotiate with him. That people like us around here would not have the freedom to do that kind of discussion in Russia. That we always talk about Russia, Russia, but there's one person who has the authority to determine where the country is going to go. And there's a feeling that he cannot be negotiated with without meat. It's like Trump. He needs the gratification of only people around him who will agree with him. But that's the narrative that's out there as well. So comment on that, please.
Yeah, sure. Those are the narratives. I do not think that we have agents inside the Kremlin. I don't think we have agents within 200 yards of the Kremlin. I think a lot of this is just speculation that runs rife in the mainstream media. I don't know much about Putin personally. What I see or what he's done, okay? I know that he was born after his big brother, Victor, perished in the blockade of Leningrad. Almost 900 straight days, Nazi and Finnish blockade. I know that his mother was given up for dead and shipped out with a bunch of dead bodies, and his father happened to find her, resuscitated her, and then came along Vladimir, okay? I know he was trained in the law as well as in intelligence work. More than that, well, all I know is that when this clown Yeltsin decided that, he had done enough damage to the Soviet economy and to the Russian economy and everything else, that maybe he would expiate his sins by by appointing somebody who could repair the damage, he picked Vladimir Putin in 2002, 2001. And since then, Russia has been resuscitated. Now, I know a lot of people who say, I hate Putin. I detest Putin. And I say, why? Oh, he poisons people. He assassinates people. And I ask them for instances. I ask them for the evidence. And I don't accept evidence from British intelligence, okay? I don't accept evidence from US intelligence. I like to see cold, hard facts. So Putin is the ruler of Russia. We need to just deal with that, okay? Now, I have been accused of siding with Putin because I say some of the same things he does. There is a, see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. When I was in Germany about 10 years ago now, making some lectures, I saw a pin, and it was this. I hope you can see it here. Okay, Putin verstehe. For some of you who know, verstehen is German for understand. And so I said to myself, wow, some people are trying to understand Vladimir Putin. That's a good thing. And my friend said, no, put that back, put that back. That shows that you're in Putin's pocket. I said, trying to understand somebody? Yeah, that's what it does. So that's how bad it is. So what do? We look at his actions. We look at whether it's quite right to call the special military operation a unprovoked war. I would submit that it was provoked up the kazoo, so to speak, and I can prove that. Do we have to accept automatically that it was illegal? Well, I talked to Professor Richard Falk about that, the international jurisprudence fellow. And he said, look, Ray, Article 51 of the UN is unsettled law, okay? There is a viable argument that you could invoke it in such circumstances. And of course, there are other viable arguments. But do you know what unsettled law means, Ray? I do. Okay, so do I automatically say this was illegal? I don't. I'm not a lawyer, but I can see that Putin, being trained in legal matters, could have used this justification. So bottom line here is this. I gave a longish talk to Massachusetts Peace Action on the 25th of April, which was a detailed rendering of those comparisons between the Cuban Missile Crisis and what Putin faces now. It went into some more detail. And after I was finished, there were remarks in the comments, and I don't read the comments, but a friend of mine wrote, and he said, this fellow said, oh, why is McGovern justifying what Putin did? Keyword, justify, okay? So my friend, who also is a psychiatrist, he said to me, I watched your speech again, and I didn't see you justifying anything. I didn't see you using the word justify or making any moral judgments. As you've told me, that's really not the purview of an intelligence analyst. And so I wrote back to this fellow, says my friend, and I said, it's really interesting. I watched it again. I saw how McGovern arrayed the facts. I saw that they were facts, provable facts, and you said he was defending Putin. Oh, so I think your conclusion was in the eye of the beholder. Think about it. These facts, undeniable facts, led you to think that Putin was right? Well, that's your business, okay? So, that's sort of where it's at. And, there are a lot of people who say, well, you can't justify, but, I'm not justifying anything. I'm just reading the facts, and I'm trying to say, like I did during my career at the CIA, look, Mr. President, this is what happened. This is why we think it happened. And you should know the gory details here, because without knowing the gory details and getting away from the rhetoric, you're never going to solve this problem. So it goes back to Vietnam and other places. So, sometimes a little color hair and 6 decades of experience in this stuff should count for something. I don't pretend to have a special corner on the truth, but I've done my damnedest best these past couple of years to ply my trade, to read all the stuff that comes out of Soviet media, Russian media, as well as US media. And my conclusion is that we really need to trim our sails here if we're to avoid the prospect of the possible use of nuclear weapons, if for no other reason than Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, Austin thinking they can't possibly afford to lose this thing, to lose the election and take the risk of being prosecuted for things that they did in the past. I will rest my case there. I hope that you understand where I'm coming from here and why I feel a little strongly about people not accusing me of siding with Putin. It's like, if you say something that he happens to agree with, that doesn't mean you're a partisan or that you're trying to justify what happened.
Thank you, Ray. Jim, did you want to, I think Jim has some words to say, and then at some point, I hope we can get to actions that we can do with regards to all of this that you've talked about tonight, as well as Julian Assange.
Hi, Ray. This is Jim Carpenter. We actually talked on the phone before when we had some technical problems, and you called in by phone, and we shared your voice on the phone. So good seeing you again. I've seen you many times. First of all, I want to thank you for your last comments, pointing out that saying that we provoked Russia, the West provoked Russia, NATO provoked Russia. That's true, and the public should know that. But that does not justify the invasion. You're right. It does not justify the invasion. In fact, there was a peace groups from all over the world got together in Vienna. I don't know if you were there or not in June, and they came out with a statement saying that we condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I agree with that statement. I condemn that. It didn't have to happen. You said what else could Russia have done? Well, if you go to worldbeyondwar.org, they list some of the other things Russia could have done. They could have taken refugees from Ukraine into Russia to take care of those refugees leaving Ukraine. That's one thing they could have done. So getting into what can we do going forward? I mean, what this group came out with in Vienna was a statement saying that there's no military solution to this war. There's no sane military solution to this war. Obviously, nuclear weapons would end the war, but it's not a sane end to the war. And of course, you pointed out that this is a very scary time with regards to nuclear weapons. So what can we do? Well, Code Pink, first of all, this Vienna conference, this peace conference said that the week of September 30th through October 8th should be a week of global action where the actions we take can help end the war. And basically what they're asking us to do is to promote a ceasefire, negotiation, and we're adding a ceasefire negotiation. But here in Progressive Democrats of America, the End of Wars and Occupation committee that I belong to is also adding, and Steve talked about this, we should also add, we should stop sending weapons to Ukraine. Because by sending weapons, we create this false hope that there's a military solution to this war when there is not. So there's a petition, and if people are still on the call, want to sign the petition can be found at codepink.org/peacenow23. Again, the petition can be found at codepink.org/ Peace Now 23. You can go online and sign that petition. Thousands have already signed it. It's going to be delivered on October 4th in DC to the senators to hope they pay attention to that petition. And let me just briefly read what that petition says. And I'd like you to comment on this idea of ceasefire, negotiation, stop sending weapons, and having this petition presented to the Senate so they don't send any more weapons. Let me read the petition really quickly. We, the undersigned, call on every member of the United States Congress to vote no on new weapons for the Russian-Ukraine NATO war. President Biden's latest request for another $24 billion, most of that for weapons and military training, will put the cost of this war at nearly $140 billion for U.S. taxpayers, most of whom live paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet. There is no military solution to this war, only heartache as the U.S. escalates a proxy war between Russia and the United States, the two most nuclear-armed nations. We need Congress to support a mutual ceasefire and diplomatic resolution that addresses the security concerns of all stakeholders, not more weapons to throw gasoline on the fire and risk nuclear war. A new CNN poll reveals that 55% of Americans oppose spending more money to continue the war in Ukraine. The answer is not more cluster munitions, depleted uranium shells, long-range fighter jets, and nuclear-capable F-16s. More weapons or only line the coffers of weapons manufacturers in the U.S. while pushing the world to the precipice of World War III. To stop the killing and bring this war to an end, we urge you to vote no on future Ukraine war funding requests and take a public stand and support a ceasefire and peace talks. That's the petition. What do you think about this idea of this mass petition and this week of action?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, yes, right. I'm asking you. Yeah.
It's great, Jim. I think it's exactly what needed, but not enough. At this point, I would like to invoke what I call the Noah principle. The Noah principle is this: no more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arcs. Now, petitions and statements are all to the good. And if you could persuade a congressperson or a senator, that's very good. But I think that we need to get off our collective rear ends and build a plank on this arc, okay? We need to build arcs. We need to do something very forward and very soon to make sure people know that we're upset. One key to that would be to persuade people that the U.S. is not faultless for this war. And what I've tried to do is lay out enough facts for you so that you appreciate. You may not buy my suggestion that the U.S. is 105% guilty of provoking this war. I'll settle for 100%. But once people know that, and once people are mobilized to do such things, then you're not about predicting rain or trying to prevent rain. You're building arcs, and arcs are what we need right now. I'll add a little footnote here. It was mentioned that David Swanson has a whole, I think he had 25 suggestions of other solutions, other things that Putin could have done. They came out very quickly. I don't think any of them really hold water, but he has challenged me to a debate. And this Sunday at World Beyond War, I'll give them some free advertising. You can watch that debate virtually. I tried manfully to tell David, I'm not going to justify the war. I'm not going to justify what Vladimir Putin did. That's not my job. An intelligence analyst lays out the facts. He doesn't make moral judgments. Okay, now I tried to get that through. But yeah, I see the billing is that McGovern is going to argue that what Putin did was justified. Then there's another person saying, well, Ukraine's looking at it this way. And then David's going to say something like, well, war is never justified. You know, I ask for an exemption here, you know, justification is not my bag of tricks, okay? So it'll be interesting. I'm not going to have a lot of time on this coming Sunday, I think it is, but it'll be interesting to see what the audience reaction is. For as much as I try, I cannot avoid people concluding that I am justifying what happened. I'm not. I'm trying to explain it. It's up to the eye of the beholder whether to make a moral judgment and justify or not justify.
I just want to one quick comment. Didn't Stoltenberg himself say recently that the war was provoked?
Well, actually, I showed a slide on that, didn't I? Yeah, he said it on the 7th of September, I believe. Yeah, I don't have it right here, but what he said was, look, we were given a draft treaty by the Russians at the end of 2021. And they wanted to have no more enlargement of NATO. Now, of course, we rejected that treaty. And Putin made it clear that he would have to invade Ukraine if we didn't agree for no more enlargement of NATO. So he invaded. And now guess what? We added one. Finland is one of our members now. So he didn't want one less. You know, he didn't want one less on this border, Ukraine. But now we have another one. So this is the juvenile mentality of Jens Stoltenberg, who was put in that job in 2014 because he will do whatever people like Blinken and Sullivan tell him to do. So, yeah, Stoltenberg admitted that it was NATO enlargement that caused the Russians to invade. I suggest that you read that. It's in my slides here. Hopefully they'll be made available to you. It was one of those comments that Stoltenberg makes rather regularly, and they are very damning on their face when you talk about whether the war was justified or unjustified.
So Ray, I'm still confused though. You said we need to put those planks into the ark.
Right.
So how can you put the planks in the ark?
Well, you know, that's really up to the local people to organize. Start with small groups, but you have to make your presence felt, okay? You have to sort of jog your neighbors out of the complacency that says, you know, what's going on here? You have to be able to take some risks, okay? Now, I've learned something, and some of you may have heard me say this before, but, you know, this kind of hair and my kind of age gives you a special advantage. And that is that if you're demonstrating, if you're getting into people's faces who deserve to have their faces confronted, then you get beat up. Well, I should say they're not going to, at least they didn't, you know, they're not going to seriously harm you, okay? But they're going to beat you up. Then people will say, Americans will say, whoa, what's going on here? Now, if younger people get beaten up, Americans say, oh, these young kids, you know, they got to come into them. What are they doing? But older people like me and like some of you, you know, the younger people would take note. And so put your body into it, folks. Make sure that you awaken this sleeping populace that we have and get them out of their doldrums, you know, get the people in the colleges and the universities, you know, away from, there's this apocryphal story about a speaker that comes and he's talking to the university president and he says, Mr. President, I understand that there's apathy on this campus to major issues like Ukraine. And the president turned to him and he says, well, I don't know, I don't care. apocryphal, but not by much. So have at it, folks. I'm delighted to have been with you tonight. I hope you invite me back again, and keep at it and kind of devise more imaginative ways to put yourself forward and wake up the rest of your neighbors.
Ray, thank you. Before you go, can you make one statement about the Australians visiting to advocate for their countryman Julian Assange and the impact that that has on war and peace?
Well, I applaud the 6 or 7 parliamentarians from Australia who, I gather, were not let into the Justice Department, but had to demonstrate on the sidewalk in front of it. They care deeply about their co-citizen, Julian Assange. You know, back in the day, and I'm talking 2 centuries ago, not 2 centuries, 2 millennia ago, and when St. Paul asserted his rights and said, "Civus Romanus sum," I'm a Roman citizen. Those Roman toadies, those plutarchs, those vassals, wherever they were, Syracuse, they, oh my God, all right, well, all right, take him out of prison, send him to Rome. And they did. Now, what happens when somebody says, "Civus Australianus sum," I'm a citizen of Australia? Well, it should have the same weight, damn it. And those, pardon my French, but those parliamentarians are trying to make that point. The point that I like to leave on Americans is that, by and large, if you talk about somebody say about Julian Assange, oh, Julian Assange, who? Oh yeah, is he the guy that raped those Swedish women? That's bad, folks. That's an effect of one of the tools in the toolbox of intelligence services. You want to blacken somebody, you use that one, okay? Now, I just say that Ann and I were privileged to be on Zoom events with Niels Melzer, who was the UN rapporteur for torture. And there was something special about Niels because he spoke Swedish. He was married to a Swede or something like that. So he went to Stockholm and he wanted to look at the records of the police for these women who complained that they were, quote, raped. Well, guess what? He read the Swedish and he reports in his book. No one complained that they were raped. There was some consensual sex, but they didn't want to press charges against Julian. All they wanted to do is make sure that he wasn't carrying AIDS, okay? And they were distraught, and it's clear in the records, they were distraught at what the Swedish police, at the behest of, you can guess it, people who wanted to defame Julian, people who wanted to put him away for the rest of his life, those same people working through liaison defamed him and just made it so that most people believe, still to this day, despite Niels Melzer and his Swedish and everything else, that Julian was guilty of some unacceptable crime. He wasn't. It was all a trick to get him cooped up and moved from place to place. There's a lot more writing on this than anyone can even fathom on freedom for the press. And you know, as we celebrate or come up to our 250th anniversary as a country, we should realize that the people who drafted our Constitution did what they could to get a good Constitution. And here's a little thing you might not know. James Madison and George Mason. George Mason lived in a house right next to where I lived in Arlington, Virginia. They came up and they devised this Constitution together, all right? Most of the drafting was done by George Mason, okay? Now, when push came to shove and Madison said, okay, we have a draft here, Mason went up to him and he said, Jim, I'm sorry, but I can't sign a damn thing. Madison says, George, for God's sake, you wrote most of it. How we it doesn't have a Bill of Rights. If it doesn't have a Bill of Rights, I can't sign that damn thing. So what does Jim do? Okay, I understand. I promise you that if you don't make a big noise about this, I'll send writers up and down the Eastern Seaboard. We'll get the Bill of Rights signed and delivered. I promise. Okay. Now, in those days, promises meant something. And that's why we have the Bill of Rights. It's an integral part of our Constitution. I hate to see the Fourth Amendment frittered away, as Ed Snowden has pointed out. I hate even more to see the First Amendment frittered away, namely freedom of the press. And if what they hope to do to Julian Assange they do, then freedom of the press is out of the window, because everybody will be afraid, whether they work in Iceland or Australia or Chile or the Soviet or Russia. They'll be afraid of the long arm of the CIA. Going to get them, and try them and put them in prison for life for violating a U.S. law. Give me a break. That's what it comes down to. So the stakes are really high. I'm really glad, Ann, that you and your crew there in Milwaukee have been so much a part of this struggle. We have to sharpen our intellects now and build still more planks for the ark that will get Julian Assange free.
Thanks.
May I go now?
Thank you so much, Ray.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night.
I'm just gonna scan the room here, so.
Keep up the good work.
The people back there.
They will be on the street in about a week.
Yeah,
We'll have a big demonstration on the September 30th. So we'll be out there.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again, Ray.
You stayed through this. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Oh, thank you.
Recording.